welcome back to yet another video. This week, because it is the Christmas season, I am going to show you how to make a Christmas costume. And that is Frodo Baggins from The Lord of the Rings. Because The Lord of the Rings is a Christmas film, because the Fellowship departs from Rivendell on December 24th, thus making it a Christmas movie. Look, I don't make the rules here. In all seriousness though, I made this Frodo costume this year for Armageddon Expo after they announced that Elijah Wood was going to be a guest. Originally, I was planning to make this costume next year because Anna and I were planning to go back to Hobbit Day at Hobbiton, but can't pass up meeting Elijah Wood dressed as Frodo Baggins, right? Anyway, without any further ado, here is how I made my Frodo Baggins costume. For the pattern, I'm using Simplicity 4923. And for the main fabric, I'm using this brown felted wool that I found at the second-hand store. And for the lining, I'm using this cute bunny rabbit cotton. Notion-wise, I'm using these two sizes of self-covering buttons and a hook and bar. First, I cut out all the pattern pieces of the brown wool. Next, using the scrap pieces of brown wool, I start covering the buttons. Now, back to assembling the pants. The first thing to do is to sew a tiny portion of the crutch seam together on the two front pieces. Then I applied some iron-on interfacing to the front flap. Then I remember I also need to cut out the lining pieces. With the lining pieces cut out, I then apply them to the back of the underlap pieces here. Then I prepare the front flap pieces by cutting these slashes here, and trying my very hardest not to cut through the stitch line. Next, I sew the under flaps to the front flaps, and can you spot what I'm doing wrong just yet, because I haven't noticed it yet? Yeah, so the under flaps are actually meant to be sewn to the pants themselves, not the front flap, so that's what I'm unpicking right here. So, then I cut the slashes open on the front panel of the pants, and then baste the under flaps to the front panel of the pants like they should have been done in the first place. And then I sew the front flap to the top of the pants along the stitch lines here. Next, I sew the two back pieces together along the seam here. Then I sew the front and back pieces together along the inner leg seam here. Then I sew together the outer leg seam on both sides. Then I do the plackets on the bottom of the pant, sort of where the calves are. As you can see, I'd interfaced one side and then I stitched them to the legs themselves here. And after using my machine to sew buttonholes on one side, I then sew the smaller size of the buttons to the other side. And after making sure that all the buttons are indeed functional, it's then time to finish the bottom edge of the pants. And to do that, I made some bias tape out of some of the leftover scraps of the brown wool, and I just sew that along the whole bottom edge here. First, I use my sewing machine and sew it to the right side of the pants. Then I fold the bias tape to the inside, encasing the raw edge, and stitch it all down by hand. Yay! And after spending an eternity doing that for both of the pant legs, I then move on to the waistband, to which I have applied some iron-on interfacing to one side, and now I'm sewing them together on the centre back seam. And repeating with the lining, of course. Then I pin and sew the brown wool layer to the waist of the pants. Next I pin the lining layer to the top of the waistband and sew that in place, before spending even longer sewing the bottom edge of the lining to the inside of the waist. Then after sewing 4 of the big buttons to the front, making the buttonholes, and then adding a hook and bar, a hook and bar to the front of the pants, they're done. For the blouse pattern, I'm using the Simplicity 4059 as the base. And for fabric, I'm using this textured white fabric that I found at the op shop. And some gorgeous real shell buttons. First, I cut out all of the pattern pieces. Then I apply interfacing to all the collar and cuff pieces. With all that done, I move on to assembly, first sewing the front and back pieces together at the shoulder seams. Then I take the bottom back piece and run some long straight stitches so that I can gather it up like this. And then that piece gets sewn into the back yoke piece here. Then to encase that raw edge on the inside, I then sew the inside yoke piece along the top seam here. And now for the bottom front piece, so that is meant to be one piece, however Frodo's shirt buttons up, so I'm cutting it in half. And then after gathering it, I sew it to the top yoke pieces just like I did the back. And now I can sew the front and back pieces together at the side seams here. And here's how it's looking so far, with an added sleeve, which I'll show you how to do now. First I fold the sleeve piece in half and sew it along this seam here. I stop just short of the end so I can create an opening for the cuff to attach to, and I do that by folding the seam allowance and sewing it here. After finishing the edge of the cuff piece, I then sew long straight stitches along the top edge so I can gather the sleeve. Then I sew it into the armhole of the shirt. And now I can add the cuff. First I sew the front and back pieces of the cuff together. Then I trim the corners so that when I turn it right side out, the corners will be nice and crisp. I then gather the bottom edge of the sleeve so that it'll be the same length as the cuff. Then I sew the cuff on by machine first. And then I hand sew the inside. I swear there is so much hand sewing in this costume. Next I sew on these really pretty shell buttons. And make the buttonholes by machine. Then I open up the holes using a seam ripper and a pin. The pin's there so that I don't accidentally cut through the thread. Okay, now that the shirt is mostly done, there is one very important thing missing, and that is some sort of closure here in the front. Now this pattern doesn't actually have one, as you know, I split the middle when I was sewing it together in the first place, but it should be as simple as adding a button placket down either side of this and chucking buttons on, theoretically. So I'm going to do that now. I'm just going to cut 2 rectangles and sew it on the front and then add the buttons to it, and we'll see if this works, shall we? Spoiler alert, it did work, and it really was as simple as putting 2 plackets down either side and adding the buttons. Now to finish it all off, here's how I did the collar. I sewed the front and back pieces together. Then I sewed that to the neck of the shirt, and you guessed it, using the machine first, and then finishing it by hand sewing the inside. For the vest, I unfortunately used this birder pattern, more about that later. Fabric-wise, I used this brown cotton velvet and the same lining that I used on the pants. Then I have the striped fabric for the back panel, and finally some vintage metal buttons. As usual, I cut out all the pattern pieces first out of the velvet, then the lining, and finally the back stripe panel, which I'm actually cutting the stripes in the wrong direction here, so I have to go out and buy a whole new piece of fabric because I didn't have enough left to cut it out the right way. Anyway, after applying interfacing to the front panels, I then sew in the darts here. After using a chalk pen to mark out where all the pockets are going, I attempt to do the welts. The key word being attempt here. So first I fold them in half and then I sew the sides down. And then I try to put the pocket lining in before realising this just ain't adding up. So I really wanted to make these functional pockets, but this is the worst written pattern I have ever worked with in my life. So many parts of it have been wrong so far, such as the seam allowance written on the welts of the pockets, the pocket pieces themselves, they tell you to cut 2 but you need to cut 4, then the pocket sizes themselves, they were about 2 inches too long, so I had to trim them down to actually fit into the vest. This has just been historically bad, so despite me trying my best to decipher this cryptic crossword puzzle that they've written to make this pattern, I can't figure it out. I found a blog of another person who had made the same vest and they also encountered the exact same issue, and so it's a bit validating. Makes me just feel like I was going crazy making this. Like, I have, 20 years sewing experience and I can't figure this out. This is the worst pattern I have ever worked with. Do not recommend this. Use literally anything else if you're going to make a Hobbit vest. Yeah, I'm going to try my best to salvage the one pocket that I was trying to get to work. It's really messy and that's bumming me out because once again the seam allowances were all wrong. The other 2 pockets that are on the front of the vest, they're just going to be fake. I'm just sewing the welts onto them and then stitching them up. They won't actually have any pocket innards because this has been driving me mental for quite a few days now. It shouldn't be this difficult and their instructions are just the worst I've ever come across in this whole time I've been sewing. I do not recommend you use this pattern. So on to the back of the vest. So as you can see here, I've sewn in one of the little tabs into the back dart and now I'm sewing the other piece together along the centre back seam here. Then I go back to the front lining piece and sew these 2 pieces together along the seam here. Then I sew the front and back pieces together at the side seam. Next I sew the outer layer to the lining layer. Then I turn the vest right side out and sew the shoulder seams together on that line there. And finally I add the buttons and the buttonholes to the front of the vest. Hello and welcome to the accessories part of this video, the part where unfortunately I was so perturbed by the vest that I had been constructing prior that I left all of this, well, not to the last minute, it's just the vest took a lot longer than, I originally planned for. Anyway, not important. Unfortunately, I didn't film as much of the section as I would have liked because I was so rushed to do it at the end. But anyway, here is the accessory section. starting with the feet. So for the feet, I also didn't want to film too much of this process because I did follow somebody else's tutorial for this, and I would much rather lead you guys to follow their tutorial than for me to take credit for it, essentially. The tutorial that I followed was by a friend of mine called Sojo Cosplays, and it's fantastic. Basically, all you needed to do was get a pair of base shoes. I managed to find the exact same Kmart ones that she did. Get some Hobbit feet. Mine were from AliExpress. Glue those to the base shoe, paint, decorate with hair, and you're done. The only thing I did differently to Sojo is, instead of relying on just paint to cover the shoes, I actually did pre-dye them first a skin colour so that the soles of the shoes would also be skin coloured and that paint wouldn't flake off the soles. And it actually worked really well, a lot better than I anticipated anyway.
And here are the ones I made all finished.
Now for the cape. So, I'm actually quite gutted I didn't film this because it was really quick and easy to do. Basically, all I did, semicircle, right, for the cape part, and then square for the hood part. You sew 2 squares together, gather it, attach it to the hood, attach it to the cape, and voila, brooch in the front, cape. And finally, the wig. So initially I brought this wig here and it's kind of awful, and then Anna, my friend who's doing Sam, convinced me to buy a human hair wig, which I am so thankful I did because she offered to style it for me, and as you can see here, after a cut, it's looking so much better. And that's everything made for the costume. Are you guys ready to see it all together? I am. Let's go.
It's a dangerous business, Frodo. Going out your door, you step onto the road, and if you don't keep your feet, there's no knowing where you might be swept off to.
And there you have it. That is how I made my Frodo Baggins costume. So, parts of this costume I enjoyed, other parts, not so much. I absolutely adore the pants I made. The fabric is fantastic. It feels so nice. They are incredibly comfortable. It went together super quick. I think I made them in half a day. And yeah, a really, really fun pattern to work with. I can't wait to use that one in the future. The blouse was fine. You don't really see much of it other than the sleeves, so like, you know, put all that time into making it a button up and then you don't even see it, so that's cool. And then the vest. Goodbye. I hate it. I hate the pattern I used. Like I mentioned halfway through the video after having a breakdown, it is the worst pattern I've ever encountered. I've also now just realised it is the same pattern I made Cameron's wedding suit out of when we got married 5 years ago, and I encountered the exact same problems then, but for whatever reason my brain didn't remember it was the same pattern, so I could have saved myself all that trouble, only I didn't. So yeah, rubbish pattern. There's plenty other Hobbit vest style patterns out there, just use any of them. anything but that one. I do apologise for not filming some things like the shoes and the cape, and that's purely just because I was in such a state after working on that vest that I ended up having to rush those things, and so they got missed. So I hope you enjoyed what I was able to show you of the process anyway. Oh yeah, I met Elijah Wood. It was fantastic. We were super nervous about meeting him because they were like rushing people through his photo op, right? And we were just like, oh man, like, we're gonna get 10 seconds with him, yay. But anyway, we rounded the corner into where he was, and unfortunately you're not allowed to film in there, but this is what happened. He took one look at us. He got super excited when he realised there were all 4 of the hobbits. He came over, he started gushing over our costumes, and then he's like, can I take a picture of you guys and share it with the other hobbits? They're going to love this. So out there in the world exists a photo of me, my friends, my mum, on Elijah Wood's phone somewhere. So that was like highlight of our day, and yeah, he absolutely loved our costumes. It was so much fun. So shout out to Armageddon for bringing Elijah Wood over to New Zealand once again. So with all of that being said, I really hope you enjoyed this video. I had a lot of fun making it, and it would mean a lot to me if you could drop a comment, maybe like it, and if you really liked it, perhaps even consider subscribing. I do a lot of sewing, crafting, and fun related things here on this channel, and I'm trying to upload a bit more frequently. Anyway, I'll catch you guys in the next one. Goodbye!